Story 1. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a quiet retreat to a lighthouse on the rugged coast of Maine. The weather had been calm, the sea peaceful, and the promise of solitude was all I had been yearning for. The lighthouse was situated at the edge of a steep cliff, overlooking the crashing waves below. The perfect spot to get away from it all. I had heard the rumors, of course, about the lighthouse being haunted, about strange occurrences and voices in the wind, but I dismissed them as stories, just local myths meant to spook tourists. The caretaker had been nice enough, explaining the history of the place and handing me the keys to the small cottage next to the lighthouse. He told me that I was the only guest for the week and that the lighthouse was closed to the public. I had the place to myself. The first few days went by without incident. I spent my time walking along the beach, reading in the cozy cottage, and watching the waves crash against the rocks. I even took a tour of the lighthouse, climbing the narrow, spiraling staircase to the top, where I had a stunning view of the endless ocean. But as the days wore on, something about the place started to feel off. There was an unsettling quiet that hung in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even when I was alone. On the third night, things took a turn for the worse. I had gone to bed early, exhausted from my day exploring the coastline. The wind howled outside, and the waves crashed violently against the rocks. But I was used to the noise. I had been sleeping soundly when I suddenly woke up to a noise that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy to be the usual creaks and groans of an old building. The footsteps were slow, methodical, as though someone or something was pacing in the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart raced, and I lay still, holding my breath, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then the door creaked open. I turned my head slowly, expecting to see the caretaker, but no one was there. The door was open just a crack, and the room was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight that peeked through the window. I could hear the wind howling outside, but there was something else now. Something that felt wrong. I got out of bed cautiously and walked to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, but there was nothing there. The house was still, eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out at me, but the hallway was empty. I told myself it was nothing, that I had simply imagined the footsteps. But as I turned to go back to my room, I felt a cold chill crawl down my spine, and a voice, soft and distant, whispered through the air, "Leave." I froze. The voice was faint, but it was there, like a breath on the wind. I turned around, but there was still no one there. The house was empty. I rushed back to my room, locked the door behind me, and tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest. The next morning, I decided to leave. I had had enough of the strange occurrences, the voices, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched. But when I went outside to pack my things, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. The lighthouse keeper's boat was gone. It had been moored at the dock when I arrived, but now it was nowhere to be seen. I ran to the phone to call the caretaker, but the phone line was dead. I couldn't reach anyone. As the day wore on, I began to feel increasingly isolated. The weather had turned foul, and a storm was quickly approaching. The lighthouse, looming high above me on the cliff, felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. I stayed inside, but the feeling of unease never left. That evening, I decided to climb the lighthouse again, desperate to get some clarity, to get a better view of the surrounding area. The wind was picking up, and the storm was almost upon me. I made my way up the narrow staircase, gripping the handrail tightly as I ascended. When I reached the top, the view was breathtaking, but there was something in the air, something heavy, something suffocating. As I gazed out at the ocean, I noticed something strange in the distance, just on the horizon. A figure standing on the rocks below, facing the lighthouse. I could barely make out the shape, but I was certain I saw the outline of a person. I blinked, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was no one behind me. The lighthouse was empty, just as it had been when I arrived. But the feeling of being watched intensified. I descended the stairs quickly and rushed back to the cottage, locking all the doors and windows. The storm outside was raging now, the wind howling, and the waves crashing violently against the rocks. I could hear the storm in the distance, but there was something else, the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, pacing back and forth outside my door. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my things and ran out of the cottage, making my way to the dock. The storm was unforgiving, but I was desperate to leave. As I ran, I looked up at the lighthouse one last time. The light from the lighthouse blinked in and out, casting eerie shadows across the ground. And for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw someone standing in the window, watching me. I never returned to that lighthouse. The caretaker was never found, and the property was abandoned. I heard rumors from the locals that the lighthouse had been built on top of an old burial ground, and that the spirits of those who had died in the area still haunted the place to this day. I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched, that something is out there, waiting for me to return. The end. Story 2. It was supposed to be a routine job, just another assignment in my line of work. I had been assigned to manage the local lighthouse on the outskirts of town for a few weeks, something I'd done many times before. The town was small, quiet, and the lighthouse was positioned on a cliff overlooking the rocky shores of the Atlantic Ocean. It was the kind of place people came to when they wanted peace and quiet, far from the noise of the city, surrounded by nature and the never-ending roar of the ocean. I had stayed in many lighthouses in the past, and nothing had ever fazed me. It was always a lonely job, with only the sound of the wind and the crashing waves as company. But this time, something felt different. It started when I first arrived. The lighthouse keeper, an elderly man named Mr. Daniels, was a quiet man, one who didn't say much. When he handed me the keys to the lighthouse, he gave me a strange look. His eyes were tired, almost haunted. I dismissed it as old age catching up with him. "Be careful here," he said, his voice low. "Things aren't always what they seem." I brushed it off as just the ramblings of an old man. But as soon as I stepped inside the lighthouse, a strange sense of unease washed over me. The place was colder than it should have been, and there was a musty smell in the air. The walls were adorned with old nautical maps, some of them faded and yellowed with age. It was almost as if the lighthouse had been untouched for years. That night, when I went to bed in the small room at the base of the lighthouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The wind howled outside, and the floorboards creaked with every step I took. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rumble of thunder from a distant storm. I fell into a restless sleep, only to be awakened in the middle of the night by a voice calling my name. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the voice became clearer, more distinct. It was a woman's voice, soft and distant, yet chillingly close. "Come to me," You won't be able to live anymore. I sat up in bed, heart racing, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. The voice sounded like it was coming from outside, from the direction of the lighthouse beacon. I tried to shake off the terror that was creeping up on me and went back to sleep. But the words haunted me, echoing in my mind. The next day, I tried to put it out of my mind. I spent the day checking the light in the lighthouse, making sure everything was running smoothly. As the sun set and the sky grew darker, I climbed to the top of the lighthouse, looking out over the sea. It was beautiful, almost serene, but there was something about the night that felt wrong, like a presence was watching me from the shadows. That night, as I lay in bed once again, I heard it this time. It was clearer, more insistent. Come to me. You won't be able to live anymore. I shot up from my bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was in the room with me. The air was thick, suffocating, and the room seemed colder than ever. I could feel something in the corner of the room, something just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. I turned on the light, but the room was empty. The door was still locked, and nothing seemed out of place. But the feeling didn't go away. It was as if something or someone was watching me, waiting for me to do something. The next morning, I decided to leave. I couldn't stand the fear gnawing at my insides. But as I packed my things and prepared to head back to town, I noticed something strange. The lighthouse had been abandoned for years, yet the caretaker's room was filled with fresh flowers, as if someone had been staying there recently. The bedsheets were neatly made, the table cleared, but there was no sign of Mr. Daniels anywhere. I left the lighthouse in a hurry, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. But as I walked away, I felt someone following me. I turned around, half expecting to see Mr. Daniels or a local fisherman. But there was nothing. The lighthouse loomed behind me, silent and still, like a watchful eye. That night, I stayed in a small motel in town. I tried to put the events out of my mind, but the voice kept coming back. It echoed in my dreams, waking me up in cold sweats, the same words reverberating in my mind. Come to me. You won't be able to live anymore. The next morning, I called the local police, asking them to check on the lighthouse. I explained that I had felt something strange, that I had heard voices, but they just laughed it off as stress or an overactive imagination. They said there was no one in the lighthouse, that it had been closed down for years, and that the caretaker had died long before I even arrived. But I didn't believe them. The voice, the presence, the feeling, it was too real. Weeks later, I heard the news. The lighthouse had been struck by lightning during a storm, and the fire had completely destroyed it. The town was devastated, but no one was more shocked than me. I couldn't help but wonder if the storm had been the thing that finally broke the curse. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that the lighthouse is still calling me, that the voice will continue to haunt me, no matter where I go. I haven't been back to the lighthouse since that day, but every time I close my eyes, I hear it. The voice, calling me from the darkness, telling me that I won't be able to live anymore. The end. Story 3. It was a cold winter night when I went to work, my shift starting at the late hour. The wind howled fiercely, and the ocean below was dark, tumultuous, as it always seemed to be at night. The small seaside town I worked in was sleepy, with only a few cars passing by and the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks. I worked as a night watchman in an old lighthouse, a job that kept me isolated from the rest of the world. The lighthouse was perched on a rocky cliff overlooking the ocean, a place where the dark sea stretched endlessly into the horizon. It was quiet, peaceful even if you didn't mind the occasional gust of wind and the salty smell of the ocean air. But that night, something felt different. The air was colder, and there was an unfamiliar hum in the breeze. As I made my way up to the lighthouse tower, I began hearing something strange. It was a faint sound at first, like a melody carried by the wind. But as I listened more carefully, it became clearer there was no mistaking it. It sounded like the cry of a woman, a deep, haunting wail that seemed to echo from the sea itself. I paused for a moment, straining to hear. The cry was so distinct, so eerie, that it sent a shiver down my spine. It was as if something or someone was calling to me from the sea, beckoning me into the darkness. The sound was hypnotic, as though it was pulling me in, drawing me closer to the edge of the cliff. For a few moments, I stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. I knew that the sea could be treacherous at night, especially with the rough waves crashing against the shore. But the sound, it was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was both beautiful and terrifying, a siren's song that tugged at my very soul. Before I knew what I was doing, I found myself walking towards the edge of the cliff. My heart raced, but I couldn't stop myself. It was as if the cry of the mermaid, if that's even what it was, had taken over my mind. I had to see where it was coming from. I had to answer the call. The closer I got to the edge, the louder the sound became, until it was almost deafening. It felt as though the cry was vibrating through my very bones. I looked down at the dark sea below, the waves crashing violently against the rocks. The moonlight reflected off the water, creating an otherworldly glow. I felt a strange sensation wash over me, a mixture of fear and irresistible pull. It was as if I was no longer in control of my own body. The desire to jump, to dive into the sea, was overwhelming. The mermaid's cry seemed to be calling my name, telling me that I was meant to join her, that I would find peace in the depths of the ocean. I took a step forward, my feet moving on their own. The sea was waiting for me, its icy waters calling me into the dark abyss. I felt the wind whip around me as I stood at the edge, ready to leap into the unknown. But just as I was about to jump, a sudden thought flashed in my mind. What if I was being deceived? What if this was all a trap, a trick played by the sea itself? I paused, my mind racing. The voice that had called me was still there, whispering in my ear, urging me to jump. But a part of me resisted. Something deep down told me that I wasn't meant to go. Not tonight. I stepped back from the edge, my legs trembling as I regained my composure. The cry from the sea slowly faded into the wind, leaving only the sound of the crashing waves behind. I took a deep breath, thankful that I had stopped myself from making a terrible mistake. The night felt heavy, as though something had just been lifted from my shoulders. But even as I walked back to the lighthouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong choice. The mermaid's call was gone, but its eerie presence lingered in my mind. I never went back to the edge of that cliff again. The sea may have tried to claim me that night, but I knew better now. Some calls are best ignored, no matter how tempting they may seem. The end